Thank you for joining us once again with Heart of a Shepherd. We are continuing our study in the book of Exodus. The title of today's devotional, Preparations for Worshiping the Lord. I do invite you to open your Bible with me to Exodus 27 and 28. Now the Lord had commanded Moses in chapter 24 and verse 12, "Come up to me into the mount." Now he and Joshua ascended Mount Sinai into the very presence of the Lord. And we read in Exodus 24 and verse 18 that they remained on the mount for 40 days and 40 nights. Well, the Lord then gave Moses, we read in verse 12 of chapter 24, gave Moses tables of stone and a law and commandments. Now, Moses was instructed in the preparations that were necessary for the people to worship the Lord with their offerings. So that began in chapter 25, and it does continue all the way through chapter 31. Now finally, the Lord, leaving nothing to chance, gave detailed designs for the sanctuary that would serve Israel as a perpetual reminder that He was in their midst. Exodus 25 and verse 8. Now that brings us to chapter 27. Now here we're given the details of the altar of brass and the outer court of the tabernacle and oil for the lamp. Now, the preparations for worship and sacrifices does continue with a description of the altar of brass served as the place of sacrifice. Now, the altar we read was made of wood, covered in brass, and was 7 feet square and 4 feet high, chapter 27 and verse 1. We also find that the four corners of the altar, described as horns, were made with rings, and poles, described as staves, allowing the altar to be carried as the nation sojourned. Now, the tabernacle was located within a courtyard that measured 75 feet on the west and east sides and 150 feet on the south and north side. You find that recorded chapter 27 verses 9 through 13. And so the outer court of the tabernacle measured some 10,000 square feet. Now, we also find that pure olive oil was required to light a lampstand that gave light from evening to morning and served as a perpetual reminder that the Lord was in the midst of His people. Now, briefly, Exodus 28. In verses 1 through 8, we have the office and the garments of the high priest and his sons. Now, we've already seen that God chose Aaron, the brother of Moses, and Aaron's sons to be sanctified, that is, to be set apart to Him, to serve as God's high priest on behalf of Israel, chapter 28 and verse 1. Now, the garments that Aaron, the high priest, wore when ministering were described as, in verse 2, holy, for glory, and for beauty. Now, they were holy because they were set apart, sanctified, and dedicated to the ministry of the high priest. Now, the glory and beauty of the garments really reflected the dignity of the high priest office. It's quite a lesson for you and me in a day in which some pastors and some churches show up with a pair of jeans and nothing but a t-shirt on, or they show up with jeans with holes and just very, very casual in the pulpit. But I can assure you that was not God's plan or design in the beginning, particularly when it came to those who ministered before God's people on His behalf. Now notice also in Exodus 28 verses 4 through 8 that we're introduced to the garments of the high priest. And you'll notice that it consisted of a breastplate, that is a vest, and then an ephod, a ritual vest that would go over the breastplate. Now, he also would wear a long one-piece robe all the way down to his feet, and a coat described as broidered, a mitre, that is a cap, and a girdle, a sash or belt that wrapped around the waist and held the breastplate of the priest in place. Now, great detail was given of the high priest's garments, but I invite you to consider the breastplate and its significance, especially verses 9 through 30 of chapter 28. And so we find that there were two precious stones, described as onyx stones, that served as buttons for the front and the back of the breastplate, and upon them were the names of the 12 tribes of Israel written, verses 9 through 12. In addition, there were two stones that rested on the shoulders of the high priest, and they were a reminder that he was Israel's mediator. And finally, the garment also had 12 precious stones. Now, each of the stones was engraved with the name of a tribe of Israel. And it was an ever-present reminder that the high priest carried the children of Israel upon his heart. Now, the high priest also, verse 36, wore a gold plate on his forehead, engraved with holiness to the Lord. Now, this was a visual reminder that the high priest belonged to the Lord, and that through the blood of sacrifices, he was Israel's mediator. Verse 38. Now, a closing thought for this brief devotional. The garments of the high priest gave specific evidence that there was meaning and purpose in every detail, from the breastplate over his heart that represented God's judgment to the bells about the hem of his robe, whose sound gave witness to his movement within the tabernacle, and the Lord's acceptance of his offering on behalf of Israel. In fact, you'll see later that a rope was actually tied about the ankle of the high priest, for if the people listened and no longer were the bells on the robe of the high priest sounding, they knew that he would have been struck dead. Because of what? Because of God's judgment, because of his own sin entering into the Holy of Holies, not holy before the Lord. Now remember, the tabernacle, the ark, the mercy seat, and the altar, that these were types or pictures that Jesus Christ, our high priest, ultimately fulfilled. Here's the answer to that. We find it in the book of Hebrews. And we read, "For Christ is not entered into the holy places made with hands, which are the figures of the true, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us." So the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies, representing God's presence on earth among his people. But Christ did not go into a place built with the hands of man. Instead, he entered into heaven and in the very presence of God after his death, burial, and resurrection. So in verse 28 we read, "So Christ was once offered to bear the sins of many, and unto them that look for him shall he appear the second time without sin unto salvation." Hebrews 9 and verse 28. Well, our study in the book of Exodus continues tomorrow, and I certainly appreciate you following Heart of a Shepherd. Bye-bye.